The 70s were when Hollywood forgot how to play it safe, churning out suspense thrillers so raw and uncompromising that modern audiences would probably walk out of theaters. These 8 films prove that sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones that refuse to give you easy answers or comfortable endings. Klute should have been just another detective thriller, but instead it became a character study so intense that Jane Fonda literally transformed herself into a completely different person, both on and off screen. Private Detective John Klute investigates the disappearance of a businessman and tracks down call girl Bree Daniels, who becomes both his key witness and the target of a stalker who's been terrorizing her with threatening phone calls, creating this claustrophobic psychological thriller where the real mystery isn't who the killer is, but whether Bree can escape the prison of her own damaged psyche. What makes this production absolutely fascinating is how Jane Fonda approached the role with such methodical intensity that she basically became Bree Daniels for months, involving herself in every detail of the character's apartment and lifestyle, including the decision to have Bree own a cat as a symbol of her need for companionship without emotional dependence. Behind the scenes, Fonda's most memorable moment wasn't even scripted. That haunting scene where Bree smokes a joint and spontaneously starts singing was pure improvisation that happened during filming and perfectly captured the character's vulnerability and loneliness. Director Alan Pakula deliberately shot the entire film with these tight vertical compositions that made every frame feel claustrophobic, essentially trapping the audience in Bree's psychological prison alongside her, which was completely different from typical thriller cinematography that emphasized wide shots and movement. The production was so emotionally draining that Fonda described it as a turning point in her personal life toward feminist consciousness, essentially using the role to explore her own relationship with power, sexuality, and independence in ways that bled into her real-world activism. Here was a thriller that cared more about the inner life of a sex worker than the identity of her stalker, proving that sometimes the most suspenseful films are the ones that force you to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature rather than just solving mysteries. Black Sunday proves that the most terrifying thrillers are the ones that feel like they could actually happen. And honestly, a movie about terrorists using a Goodyear blimp to bomb the Super Bowl is probably more plausible than half the action movies being made today. Kabakov races to stop a Palestinian terrorist and an unhinged Vietnam veteran from detonating a bomb-laden blimp over Miami's Orange Bowl during the Super Bowl, which sounds like the kind of plot Tom Clancy would reject for being too realistic and depressing. What makes this production absolutely insane is that director John Frankenheimer was using an actual Goodyear blimp for the aerial sequences, with real pilots flying dangerously close to stadiums and populated areas, while Bruce Dern was having method acting meltdowns that created genuine tension between cast and crew. Behind the scenes, Dern's volatile temperament and intense preparation methods led to multiple clashes with Frankenheimer, but somehow that real-world friction enhanced the performances and made the on-screen paranoia feel completely authentic. The physical dangers were so extreme that the film crew was essentially conducting their own terrorist operation, flying an unmarked blimp around major American cities during an era when people were genuinely terrified of hijackings and bombings. Creating this meta-commentary where making a movie about terrorism required actual terrorist-like tactics. The political controversy was immediate and intense, with critics arguing that the film was giving terrorists a blueprint for attacking major sporting events, leading to actual security changes at stadiums across America that are still in place today. Here was a thriller that accidentally became a training manual for Homeland Security, proving that sometimes the most effective suspense films are the ones that make audiences realize how vulnerable they actually are to the exact scenarios they're watching for entertainment. The Killing of a Chinese Bookie should have been John Cassavetes' masterpiece about the suffocating nature of artistic dreams. But instead, this 1976 fever dream became a production nightmare that nearly broke its director and lead actor emotionally. Cosmo Vitelli runs a seedy strip club and gets in deep with the mob after a gambling debt forces him to murder a Chinese bookie, creating this claustrophobic character study where the real enemy isn't the gangsters, but the soul-crushing forces that destroy creative passion. What makes this production absolutely wild is the moment when Ben Gazzara told Cassavetes he couldn't understand his character because he wasn't having any fun, causing the director to break down crying on the limo floor and deliver an impassioned speech about how the gangsters represented all the petty people who try to kill artistic dreams, essentially turning the film into a meta-commentary about Cassavetes' own battles with Hollywood studios. Behind the scenes, the editing process was complete chaos, with Cassavetes leaving town while assistants battled illness and tried to make sense of footage that barely covered crucial scenes like the actual murder, leading to a 1,035-minute cut that confused audiences so badly that Cassavetes had to re-edit the entire film 2 years later into a tighter 108-minute version. The production was so emotionally draining that it became the movie Cassavetes used to work through his own existential crisis about whether independent filmmaking was worth the constant struggle against commercial pressures. Here was a gangster movie that cared more about the psychology of performance and survival than actual crime. proving that sometimes the most suspenseful films are the ones where characters fight invisible enemies that represent real-world creative destruction. Deliverance turned a simple canoe trip into the most traumatic outdoor adventure ever filmed. And honestly, the fact that nobody died during production is more surprising than anything that happens in the actual movie. Four city friends take a weekend canoe trip down a wild Georgia river that becomes a nightmare of sexual assault, murder, and survival when they encounter hostile locals, forcing them to confront brutal violence and make life-or-death decisions that expose the thin line between civilization and savagery. What makes this production absolutely insane is that director John Boorman forced his cast to navigate real whitewater rapids on the dangerous Chattooga River with minimal safety protocols, creating genuine life-threatening situations where Burt Reynolds nearly drowned doing his own stunts, while the crew filmed actual terror on the actors' faces. Behind the scenes, Ned Beatty's infamous assault scene was so emotionally devastating that it traumatized everyone involved, requiring careful choreography to balance raw impact with sensitivity while filming in the remote Georgia wilderness, where the isolation and harsh conditions mirrored the story's themes of man versus nature. The physical dangers were so extreme that the cast faced unpredictable currents, submerged rocks, and freezing temperatures that led to multiple near drownings and injuries, essentially conducting their own survival thriller while making a movie about survival. The cultural backlash was immediate and intense, with critics arguing that the film exploited Southern stereotypes and rural communities, while others defended its stark portrayal of violence and class tensions that still resonate today. Here was a thriller that required its cast to literally experience the terror they were portraying, proving that sometimes the most effective suspense comes from genuine fear rather than movie magic. The Day of the Jackal should have been just another political thriller about assassinating Charles de Gaulle, but instead this 1973 masterpiece became a blueprint for methodical suspense that completely redefined how tension works in cinema. The mysterious British assassin known only as the Jackal gets hired by disgruntled French military officers to kill President de Gaulle, leading to this cat-and-mouse game between a cold professional killer and police commissioner Claude Lebel, who's trying to stop an assassination plot without causing public panic. What makes this production absolutely fascinating is how director Fred Zinnemann demanded such obsessive realism that Edward Fox spent months studying actual assassin techniques while the crew obtained real forged documents and shot in authentic government buildings across Europe, creating this procedural accuracy that feels more like a documentary than a thriller. Behind the scenes, Zinnemann's perfectionist standards created constant tension with the cast, especially Fox, who found the rigorous preparation exhausting. But somehow that professional coldness enhanced his performance as a methodical killer who treats murder like an engineering problem. The political controversy was immediate and intense, with French authorities reportedly monitoring the production and creating unofficial pressure that affected shooting permits, essentially proving the film's point about government paranoia and the vulnerability of political leaders. The film's enigmatic ending, where the Jackal's true identity remains unknown even after his death, was so controversial that audiences expected more dramatic closure, but Zinnemann's decision to emphasize the anonymous, impersonal nature of professional assassination created this haunting meditation on political violence. Here was a thriller that cared more about psychological realism than explosive action, proving that sometimes the most suspenseful films are the ones that treat violence as a cold, calculated business rather than entertainment. Assault on Precinct 13 proves that John Carpenter could create more tension with a $100,000 budget than most directors achieve with $100 million explosions. And honestly, this 1976 siege thriller makes every modern action movie look like expensive therapy for people with short attention spans. Lieutenant Ethan Bishop gets stuck manning a nearly abandoned police station that becomes the target of a mysterious street gang's relentless assault, forcing him to unite with dangerous prisoners in a desperate fight for survival that plays out like a Western showdown in urban decay. What makes this production absolutely insane is how Carpenter shot the entire film guerrilla style in a real abandoned police station, with a skeleton crew working late nights in the grittiest parts of Los Angeles, creating this authentic atmosphere of isolation and danger while composing the film's haunting electronic score himself on a budget so tight that actors had to improvise most of their dialogue. Behind the scenes, the post-production became a nightmare when American distributors butchered the film with heavy editing and retitled it multiple times, frustrating Carpenter, who watched his carefully crafted tension get diluted for television broadcasts, while international distributors initially rejected it for being too violent for mainstream audiences. The legal and rights issues were so complicated that the film disappeared from circulation for years, only finding its cult status through midnight screenings and home video where audiences could finally experience Carpenter's original vision of claustrophobic urban warfare. The film's influence on siege thrillers and action movies is undeniable, essentially creating the template for every cops and criminals team up against common enemy movie that followed. But what makes it special is how Carpenter treated the genre as a canvas for exploring social anxieties about urban decay and institutional collapse. Here was a thriller that understood that real terror comes from being abandoned by the system that's supposed to protect you, proving that sometimes the most effective action films are the ones that focus on human survival rather than spectacular destruction. The Silent Partner should have been just another bank robbery thriller, but instead, this 1978 Canadian gem became the most methodical game of psychological chess ever filmed, where Elliot Gould's mild-mannered bank teller outsmarts Christopher Plummer's psychotic Santa Claus in ways that make modern heist movies look like finger-painting exercises. Miles Cullen discovers a robbery note and decides to steal the money himself before the actual robber arrives, leading to this twisted cat-and-mouse game where the quiet bank employee becomes more dangerous than the violent criminal stalking him through Toronto shopping malls and apartment buildings. What makes this production absolutely wild is how director Daryl Duke got forced off the project when producers demanded a graphic beheading scene. He refused to film, bringing back screenwriter Curtis Hanson to handle pickups and editing in a chaotic post-production process that somehow enhanced the film's paranoid atmosphere. Behind the scenes, Elliot Gould maintained professional calm despite the creative warfare swirling around him, praising the intelligent script while the film underwent extensive re-editing that reshaped its tone from pure Hitchcockian suspense into something darker and more morally ambiguous. The controversial beheading scene that caused all the drama was inserted against the original director's wishes, creating this unsettling blend of cerebral thriller and shocking violence that confused some critics but perfectly captured the film's exploration of how ordinary people can become monsters when pushed to survive. Here was a thriller that understood the most terrifying villains aren't the obvious psychopaths, but the quiet opportunists who discover they're capable of anything, proving that sometimes the most suspenseful films are the ones where you're never sure who to root for. The Parallax View proves that the most terrifying conspiracies are the ones where you realize the good guys might not exist. And honestly, this 1974 masterpiece makes every modern political thriller look like a children's story about democracy actually working. Investigative journalist Joe Frady witnesses a political assassination and discovers the Parallax Corporation, a shadowy organization that recruits psychologically unstable assassins to manipulate elections and eliminate inconvenient politicians, leading him on a paranoid journey across America where every revelation brings him closer to becoming the next target. What makes this production absolutely fascinating is how Warren Beatty almost directed the film himself before hiring John Frankenheimer, creating this tense collaboration where the executive producer kept pushing for deeper political commentary while the veteran director struggled with the psychological intensity demanded by the material. During production, Frankenheimer created this suffocating atmosphere that deliberately echoed the film's paranoia themes, pushing actors to deliver performances where mistrust simmered beneath every gesture, while the crew developed groundbreaking visual techniques using mirrors and disorienting angles that made every frame feel like surveillance footage. The film's visual innovations were groundbreaking, using mirrors, reflections, and disorienting camera angles to create this sense of constant surveillance and fractured reality that influenced every conspiracy thriller that followed, while editor Robert Estrin crafted fragmented cuts that made audiences feel as confused and isolated as the protagonist. The political timing was perfect and terrifying, arriving after Watergate and Vietnam, when Americans were genuinely questioning whether their government was controlled by invisible forces, making the Parallax Corporation feel less like science fiction and more like investigative journalism. Here was a thriller that understood the real horror of conspiracy isn't the dramatic reveals but the slow realization that individual agency might be an illusion, proving that sometimes the most effective political films are the ones that leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about power.